Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today for this great panel on the politics of the environment. I want to take a quick second to introduce myself. My name's Jesse J. Holland. I am the Saturday host of Washington Journal on C-SPAN. And I am so pleased to be joined by such a distinguished panel as we talk about the politics of the environment. I'm going to do a quick introduction of our distinguished guests, and then we're going to get right into it. Remember, during this panel, if you have questions for us, use your Whova app to put your questions into the panel, and I'll bring them up to our distinguished guests. So let me briefly introduce everyone on the panel. Let's start with Alan Spears. Alan is a Senior Director for Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association. Jaelon Murray, who is the Regional Director for my senator, Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. And Tamara Toles O'Laughlin, who is a National Climate Strategist. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us today. And let's get into it. I'm going to direct my first question to all of you. Since the panel is about the politics of the environment, it brings up the first question. Why is environmental issues why are they even political in the first place? Everyone should be in favor of clean air, clean water, a healthy environment. But the environment's become a hot political topic. Why is this even political anyway? I'll start with you, Jaelon, and then I want to hear from Alan and Tamara.
Absolutely. I think if you've seen the most recent Judas and the Black Messiah, I think Daniel Kaluuya is reviving Fred Hampton's notion that where there's people, there's power. You do start to understand that there are voices seldom more credible than those who've been through distress and are seeking redress. And I think another Chesapeake native who needs no introduction, Rachel Carson, warned against the adversarial side of this decades ago, in particular, humans feeling the need to wield power to alter nature. And I think Black and brown communities across the country have disproportionately borne the brunt of this a confluence of economic, scientific, and environmental forces. And I think at the bedrock of our country, one of those elements that I think is central to this question is proprietorship. And you can trace the concept of sovereignty all the way back to Roman law, English common law, et cetera. And I think environmental policy relative to all other areas of legislation is relatively nascent. It's primarily regulatory, and it's at a distance from channels that the public would normally use for public will, like communication of it is generally inequitable. And I think it's often communicated in a one-dimensional manner that doesn't necessarily yield itself to understanding the interconnectedness of environmental issues, ultimately, which is what leads us to urgency. So I think for my roots, my hometown, I'm from Talbot County on the Delmarva Peninsula. And for centuries, we've overwhelmingly heralded the natural world as divine. So the ownership question isn't something that we are confronted with, but I think in many other regions of the country, the scale of exploitation and the question of ultimately who decides is one of the areas that the politics of environment stems from.
Alan, what do you think?
I think fundamentally the environment is a civil rights issue. And the challenge, though, is that for a long time, Black and brown people in this country and elsewhere were occupied with other things related to civil rights, voting rights, anti-lynching campaigns, other things like that. And so we've got the birth of a modern environmental movement that sort of got started and moved forward, advanced without us. And there were some of the people who were driving that movement who thought, well, they're not there, so they don't care, which is anything but true. And I think the politics that's behind this is the politics in an adversarial system where you have some people who want to advance economic opportunities and oftentimes do that perhaps at the expense of national parks, communities, healthy environment, clean air, clean water. And we are in a fight right now to preserve our way of life, our planet, and to do so in a way that really brings those two things, which are not at all separate, but binds them together in a way that can work for everybody. but it's a challenge and it's a huge fight. And we don't know yet the outcome. We can understand from the political dimensions that we are still in a political environment where we could go back to anti-regulatory measures, anti-regulatory politicians being in charge. We've got an opportunity now to fix some of the damage, and we've got to make sure that that happens moving forward. It's going to take everybody being involved and being engaged. So this notion, if there are any Black and brown people out there who somehow think that the climate is not an issue that applies to us, we need to fix that. But then for the millions of people who are invested in this, we've got to make sure that they've got a space at the table and that their voices are being heard.
Now, Tamara, I saved you for last because I learned at an early age that we should always listen to our Black women. So I saved your comments for last, but I want you to answer two different questions. One, why are environmental issues political? But I want you to also touch on what Alan just said. Are environmental rights the same as civil rights?
So I'm glad you pointed out, because I was going to respectfully disagree with Alan and say first that anytime you're talking about resources, issues of equity, the transfer of power and therefore wealth, it is political, right? Because we are talking about common goods that belong to all of us, stewarded through systems that we developed in a political system that is convenient and has to relate to the public will at any time in order for it to be valid. So given that all of those things are true, we cannot talk about fish and wildlife. We cannot talk about land use and stewardship. We cannot talk about clean air and survival. We cannot talk about transportation and energy unless we're talking about resources and equity. And so all of those things are very triggering because it requires us come into some agreement about how we're going to operate. And that agreement is called government. So it has to be political by nature, but even the politics of it are subject to the procedures that we put in place and the policies that either own where we are now and where we want to go and set us up for a future that we are looking for, or set us up to fail. So I do think it's really important for us to recognize that we have always been in this work. We have always stewarded the land. We have always been folks who have not, before we were forcefully relocated in that government program called slavery. We were stewarding our resources elsewhere, and then we came here and stewarded everyone else's. So that I balk at the idea that a healthy environment would not be political because it involves deciding who gets poisoned and who does not. The images behind me are representatives of just two of the ways that our communities are sacrificed in one of the environments where we show up. So when we are thinking about issues that affect our community, we have to recognize that we are everywhere. We are in this work, whether we have the power, whether we have built enough power to be able to make decisions on our own behalf or are acting in service of other people. We have not been missing from the conversation, just from leadership.
Now, one of the things I want to say here is that everyone on this panel is either in Maryland right now or in Washington, D.C. But like Tamara was just saying, my roots are in Mississippi. I'm a seventh generation Mississippian whose family still lives on the same land that our ancestor bought after the Civil War. We still live there. So there's no doubt that we've been stewards of the land. But being stewards of the land has become a political issue. And there's no way we can avoid what is the hottest political issue when we talk about the environment. So one of our viewers have asked this question already, and I want you all to respond to what is the hottest political issue about the environment, and that is the Green New Deal. So for all of you, the question is, what is your personal stance on the Green New Deal? And what can we do, people who care about the environment and are in favor of the Green New Deal, what can we do to support strong and progressive changes like that bill in this country? Go ahead, Tamara, jump in first.
Well, I wanted to just connect the last question in this one and say that as we sit here having this discussion, Deb Holland is fighting for her political life to be able to get into a job that by all rights as a part of a community that has stewarded this land since it was called the other thing, like when it was Turtle Island. We're having a conversation about who has the right to steward it. It's a political fight, not because the stewardship of resources, the development and management of lands are not a public conversation, but because it's about wealth. It's really about who manages the wealth of the earth, who stewards it, who gives it to folks, and whose eye is a good one to view this work through. So I just wanted to invoke that we are grounded in a political moment, because that's what's up for grabs, everything. And I think the Green New Deal laid out the roadmap for how we get to making sure that the people who were not in the original agreements are involved in the next wave of agreements. The Green New Deal, whether you call it by that or the Thrive Agenda or any of the other pieces of legislation that have laid out this roadmap, what we're actually talking about is jobs, infrastructure, and human health. And let the politics be damned, I'll say it, that we are going to pay for jobs or the lack of jobs regardless. We're going to pay for human health or the disease that comes from not having human health. We are going to pay for infrastructure, or we're going to pay to fix all the communities that have been crushed under it as it breaks down. So whether we call the Green New Deal or we don't, what we have to do to fight for it is recognize that the tag is not the point. The building, the fight for the future of these lands is what we're talking about. Are we going to have a community right to not be poisoned? Are we going to build infrastructure that takes people to jobs where they're not continuing to support the degradation of the lands around them? Are they creating space for the ways that we choose to live as the people who exist now? Or are we given unnecessary and oversized deference to decisions that were made when, frankly, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women had no rights? So the question is, are we going to continue to live in reverse, or are we going to start to look forward? And the Green New Deal is a really great platform for us to open up that public dialogue about our resources and get there.
Alan, the Green New Deal is the boogeyman that conservatives use to point to progressives and environmentalists and say they're going to ruin the planet and put people out of work. Is the Green New Deal worth it?
Well, I think we've got to have some changes to the way that we've been operating on the standard operating procedure related to the climate. We have clearly a climate emergency. For the organization I work for, the National Parks Conservation Association, that agency manages about 88 coastal parks on the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Gulf Coast, and on the Great Lakes. And 92% of those 88 parks have seen some significant rise in sea levels. And we had been having a conversation offline about Maryland's Eastern Shore and the incredible African-American history that's captured down there. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. One of my campaigns that I'm proud of for NPCA was to support the designation of the Harriet Tubman National Monument, Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Monument. Also did work at Fort Monroe on Chesapeake Bay. Well, it's horrible to designate these places as new national parks that commemorate the African-American experience only 5, 10, 20 years later, to have visitors required to rent scuba gear in order to be able to see these places because they're underwater or partially submerged. So every place has a climate story. The national parks are coping with that as best they can, but we're going to have to see some changes and some technology and some legislative fix to this problem, because there are some inherently political challenges that we've got to face and overcome to make sure that we are protecting and preserving these resources, protecting and preserving these communities, and protecting and preserving the planet that we live on, because there is no planet B.
Jaelon, let's talk about the political reality of the Green New Deal. Whether you're for it or against it, you hear the same people who talk about the impossibility of reparations. They speak about the Green New Deal the same way. Why should we even try for the Green New Deal? It's never going to pass. We hear the same talk about reparations. Why should we ever even talk about reparations? Because it's never going to pass. So the Green New Deal, what's the political reality of it? And how can that political reality change if the political reality is it's never going to pass?
Well, I can start off by saying that our senator has co-sponsored this legislation, and the chamber that he sits in looks a lot different than it was when it was initially introduced. And I think in the last month, we all have a reason to be excited, one, about the new administration making climate an essential element of both US foreign policy and national security, as well as a lot of optimism in a new EPA nominee, Michael Reagan, who does understand Main Street America, does understand coastal America, and does understand the confluence of both as it pertains to communities of color. So I definitely agree with both of my panelists here in saying that this is a great start and things do deserve to be pushed. And I don't necessarily think that this is the only avenue. I think that a lot will come in this new Congress that either builds on or goes by another name, as was suggested earlier. But nonetheless, a lot of these components are long overdue. And I think they reinforce a lot of narrative by putting some sustainable things and long-lasting things behind some of those legislatively.
Now, many people ignore, like Tamara was saying earlier, the fact that people of color have been involved in environmental issues from day one. But what we do also have to realize is that when we talk about environmental issues, everyone's not on the same page because everyone doesn't live in the same place. Environmental issues mean one thing if you live in a city. They mean another thing if you live in the suburbs. And environmental issues might be completely different if you live in a rural area. Environmental issues, the things that you care about specifically about the environment, mostly depend on where you live. So how do we harmonize all of these different views about the environment and come to a solution that we can push forward that will help the farmers in the rural areas, the two-parent families, and the urban and the suburban areas? What's that one solution we can come up with that fits everyone, that everyone in the Black and brown communities can get behind? Tamara, I'll let you go to that one first.
Sure, I don't mind getting set up. So one thing I'll say is that there is no one thing, there is no big fix. Anyone who tells you that they're selling you something, run away. Just take it from me. I assure you that when we're talking about issues of land and air and water and transportation and jobs and infrastructure and human health and weatherization, so many of our family in the South, we are in the North because, well, DC is middle ground, quite literally.
Middle ground.
But what I'll flag is that for those of us whose families are closer to north because of the Great Migration, there are real reasons that we still have generations of family in the South. Those folks have been experiencing a 100-year storm, and they will be doing so again and again, whether we're talking about Louisiana or Texas or Alabama or Georgia. Like, we are just not in a conversation about what we can imagine. We should be in a conversation about how we deal with extreme events. And whether you are in a rural setting or urban setting, these issues of land stewardship and protection and who's going to pay for you to deal with what climate change is doing to you, these things are happening now. There are no contingency plans for what the climate crisis is already doing. As folks will tell you, whether they are crabbers and spend their time on the water, whether they are people who recreationally enjoy access to the waters of the United States, whether they are folks who enjoy green space, park space, or have the beauty of being able to spend time in our national parks. We are folks who experience the environment no matter where we are. We carved the city out of the country. And so I think one thing we really need to do to help this work along is to stop acting as though the things we built are entirely different universes.
Jaelon, how do you harmonize environmental concerns from people in Baltimore, people in Chestertown, people in Ocean City, people in Cambridge? They all have different environmental concerns. How do we harmonize all these concerns so we can have one big push forward?
I think one of the things that might be helpful to invest in going forward, and I know I can speak on this personally, as a product of which would be environmental literacy. At least across the Delmarva, there is a very strong presence of NOAA's Be Wet program. That's all the way from kindergarten through grade 12. And the acronym stands for Bay Watershed Education and Training. And I think it has made me just as comfortable communicating with the horseshoe crab as an urban organic farmer. And I really do owe a lot of my foundation to that. And it complements the legacy that I've inherited being from the earliest free Black community in the country. And additionally, I know that in tuning in, we have several others who have also participated in the Williams Mystic Maritime Studies program. And I think that has forced me and has forced a lot of other people via their occupation or just by where they live to embrace the natural world as their classroom. So I think the nation's largest estuary is a great place to start. It's one of the most dynamic ecosystems in the world. And I think the people that live in and along all the crevices of the bay inherit that and quite frankly reflect that in the narratives that they carry and the work and changes that they'd like to see.
Alan, we have national parks that are inside the cities. We have national parks that are on the mountains. We have national parks in the Mississippi Delta. We have national parks in the swamps in Louisiana and Florida. How do you harmonize all of these different environmental concerns and make sure everyone is protected?
Jesse, I'm not sure you harmonize. I think what has to happen is, where you stand on the environment depends on where you sit or where you live and what your passions are. And I think we can get behind the fact that there are threats that we all face given our climate emergency, which is going to take care of all of us, impact all of us in one way, shape, or form. The national parks were established to protect historic, cultural, scenic, and recreational resources, natural resources that as a country, generally speaking, this nation decided were important to protect and preserve. The Park Service just entered its second century a couple of years ago in 2016. So we've made a commitment that's 102, 103, 104 years old at this point in time to protect and preserve these resources. As an African-American advocate for national parks, I'm particularly interested in protecting and preserving these African-American experience sites. There are about 40 of them spread throughout the national park system. And many of these places are in low-lying or coastal areas. And if they're not impacted by rising sea levels, they're impacted by aggressive storm surges, 100-year storms, as Tamara referenced just a while ago. We've got fire, we've got soil aridity, we've got all kinds of things that are impacting national parks. And so I think what happens is, let's hopefully embrace people where they are. So if you've got somebody who is a fan of our history and culture and wants to see that preserved, there's a climate component to that. If you have kids and you'd like to see them grow up without asthma, bronchitis, or cancer, there's a climate component to that. If you just want to live in a neighborhood where the river isn't running through your basement, there is a climate component to that. And so what I think we need to do is to allow people not necessarily to be harmonized, but to appreciate when and where they enter on this climate issue and then bring them together to find solutions that will work for the greatest plurality or majority of people in this country.
All right, Tamara, I saw you co-signing with a couple of snaps there. So I'm going to open, I want you to add on this, but I'll add on this to the question. What a lot of us see as a problem with a lot of the environmental solutions is they're not quick fixes. When you start talking about climate issues, you're talking about 10, 15, 20 years down the road. This is not going to change anyone's life today. How do you get around that sometimes erroneous perception?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think there's anybody in Texas who would agree that climate change is not happening right now. I don't think there's anyone in Louisiana who would say that climate change isn't happening right now. I don't think the 26 oil and gas companies that are going to be quaking in their boots because Annapolis is suing them for sunny day flooding would tend to agree. I think the fact that we have had fights in the state of Maryland about bringing in health impact assessments to the review of how we cite things that harm people, fossil fuel infrastructure coming in through our Public Service Commission. Those are not abstract discussions. Those are people trying to figure out, how do I make sure that myself, my family, the generations that will come before me, and the folks who have brought me to this moment in this place in my life, my elders will be protected by the government that we're all giving our resources to, that sets up the marketplace for folks who we transact with. So I do think that there are plenty of people feeling it right now. And I also want to tell this esteemed group of people that we have till 2030 to get it fixed. Forget what you heard, and no matter, and whoever you heard it to, please refer them to me. But let me point you into the direction that this is the climate decade. If we don't set the tone, if we don't change the infrastructure, if we don't stop depending on things that destroy everything we care about and investing in the future that we can actually live through and move from survival mode into a thriving position, we will fail to deliver the generations anything that they can live with. People are looking at Mars. Some of us are looking at it as an opportunity to escape these mistakes. That's not most of the people that I know. That doesn't represent my community. And as we get into more public discussions about whose fault this is, I believe that we will find ourselves less concerned about where we enter in the continuum, which is an exact right way to think about how we get people to recognize they're in the same conversation. But when we start to figure out who the bad guy is, that list gets pretty short.
So Tamara, I can't let you go without asking the question. What is the 2030 deadline you're talking about? So everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, so 2030, the end of the climate decade, it's when we have our last best chance to get emissions into a posture where we can continue to survive and have this discussion. If we push it off till 2050, if we decide that buildings don't have to get off the map in terms of our grid, that we can't keep putting pollution into the air, that we can't stop expanding our highways into infinitum and cars that are killing everyone at the first and last mile in our own cities and towns, we will wake up in 2030 in an irreversible loop. That means the greenhouse gases turn this into a fiery gas ball, and all of our debates are closed.
All right. Don't say you haven't been told. I want to remind all of our viewers that you can always put your questions into Hoover, and I will move your questions into this conversation as we go forward. In fact, some of your questions are better than the ones that I was going to ask, so I'm going to bite off your questions. We were just talking about infrastructure. So one of our viewers who has this question I think needs to be asked of all of you, and Jaelon, I'm going to ask you to speak to it first. The question is, we hear a lot about the new administration introducing a massive infrastructure package. How can we ensure that green infrastructure, including water infrastructure and equitably distributed green jobs and greening projects, are included in the package? Jaelon, take that on first.
Well, I will start out by explaining that this has been one of the upfront executive orders that have come in a string tied to climate in the past month and a half or so, and I can give greater detail to that here. One of the orders catalyzes the creation of jobs, as we spoke about earlier, ranging from construction, manufacturing, engineering, and skilled trades, and directing that every federal infrastructure investment reduces climate pollution. And this is definitely a 180-degree pivot from the Trump administration. And I will say that a lot of these steps are taken to reinforce states that have already advanced a lot of clean energy and transmission projects under federal siting and permit processes, but it also takes into account the communal aspect of environmental sustainable progress. And I think by being on this call, I'm trying to reassure to all viewers now that advocating through staff like myself, or even the direct Congress member, or even in your assemblies, communicating to them what your priorities are. They do make it all the way into policy, and Maryland has been a national pioneer in doing so. So I do want to reassure people that that is also a way to advocate and make sure that what you think is there can be improved, or what you think is missing should be addressed.
Alan, for those of us who have been converted to the idea that green infrastructure is not only to our advantage, but necessary, how do we convince our politicians that we're right and this has got to be part of a national policy?
Vote. We're talking about a brand new administration, which we've got a president who is on record now saying that climate is a national emergency. That's certainly a change. The National Parks Conservation Association is a nonpartisan organization. We understand that we've got champions on both sides of the aisle and in the independent party as well. And so we need to harness that power, but vote. We are in a circumstances right now where nothing is guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed in 2022, nothing is guaranteed in 2024. And if you think that you have seen the worst that politics can deliver for this country, for this planet, stay tuned. Because if you don't vote and we are not active and engaged, that's going to be the worst possible downfall for a participatory democracy like ours. I would also just add, in terms of infrastructure, other things related to climate and the environment, we need to make sure that these movements and these policies are inclusive, that they're just, that they're equitable. We also need to make sure that they are adequately funded. You cannot do a massive infrastructure package and have it contain all those elements and then fund it for $12.75 that some senator or congressperson pulled out of the change from between their couch cushions in the foyer of their office. So we've got to work with House and Senate appropriation staff. We've got to work with the administration. We've got to make sure that there's adequate money being put towards this climate emergency to resolve it and not just wave at it as it goes by.
Tamara, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that a lot has been said here. I think it's really important for us to be thoughtful about infrastructure packages, because infrastructure doesn't mean what it used to mean. We're all stuck in our homes because of COVID if we have been fortunate enough to not be harmed by it unto death. And so infrastructure now means broadband. Like, we're in a conversation where we have to think about energy generation and transmission. And the way that you read about in your school books, what it was like for people for the Alexander Graham Bell, and for us to get the telephone, and for railroad, and for us to make decisions that move water from places that should be a desert to places that have become cities as a result of deals that were made. We are in a generation of change. We are in a place where the new agreements are being made. So who has energy, what kind it is, who has infrastructure, means whether you have the skill sets, the education, the training, and the retraining, not just bridges and highways and buses, which are all important, but we have to look at the future of work. We have to look at the market that we are building by ending our relationship to fossil fuels and what that's going to mean in our state. I have to say, sitting in Maryland, I've sat in meetings since 2015 when I wrote the first press release announcing that we were getting offshore wind, and it is 2021. Just want to flag that there are opportunities in our front yard and our backyard to do things that will put us in the driver's seat, getting to that new economy that creates jobs, all the infrastructure we need to survive, and gives us the opportunity to be stewards of the land into many generations. And if we are not taking the federal reins to do that, if we are not ringing the phones off the hook to our senators who have so much power, if we are not owning the fact that when we dropped our vote in the box, it was a marker saying we're going to be in relationship. And the rule of thumb for my days as a lobbyist is that if you're quiet, everybody thinks you're happy. So remind folks that your silence does not mean that you agree. Fight for what you believe in and show up and march in the streets, because you can build the best policy in the world, but if there's no political cover for it, it just doesn't happen. In Maryland, we have really smart folks who've been working on environment for a long time, operating at a lot of levels of government. But they don't get the sway that it takes to organize your colleagues if they disagree about the difference between keeping things the same today and fighting for tomorrow, if those of us who cast a vote sit at home hoping that it continues to bring in returns. So we are in a partnership with our government and will only do for us what we demand rigorously and regularly.
Alan brought up voting to make our environmental concerns known. Now, keep in mind that we saw the state, local, and federal government reaction to the environmental issue that happened in Flint, Michigan, where private people, including my church in Alexandria, Alpha Street Baptist Church, had to send clean water all the way to Michigan so people would have clean water. And people did that from around the country. And it still hasn't been resolved to this day. So if you are a person of color, you're Black and brown, and you see an urgent environmental issue, the election day isn't coming up for a while. What do you do right now? What are the steps you should take? Give our people something that they know they can do right now. We all talk about voting, but you only get a chance to really vote in an election maybe once a year in an election. What can you do right now to solve these environmental issues that may be affecting you? I'll start with you, Jaelon.
Do you mind if I defer to another colleague here on the panel?
Oh, sure. Alan, since you brought up voting, go ahead.
Well, real quickly, I understand, the fierce urgency of now as it relates to the climate emergency, as it relates to so many things that we're facing right now. Just from a historian's perspective, it took more than a minute to get voting rights. It took more than a minute to get some of these legislative victories and some of these social victories that people fought and paid the ultimate price for in so many instances. And just the history of resistance to slavery, resistance to oppression, resistance to lynching, all the other things that we've had to think about and confront as people of color right now. And so I'm not swayed by any arguments if people are coming forward to say, it's not going to happen in the next 5 minutes, and therefore why bother? So I do think that voting is important, but I also would attach what Tamara has spoken to, I think so effectively, is this notion of a continued commitment and a relationship to the political perspective and the political way that things are happening right here. So that it is voting, but it's also paying attention to where the money is going. It's paying attention to how people are voting. And if someone says that they support the Green New Deal, but then they help to support policies that are in opposition to that, and they're bringing in every trash trap incinerator project they can to your neighborhood just because they can, then there has to be a way to hold people accountable. So it's the ballot, it's accountability, and it is connecting to other people, because I know we're tired. I know everybody's tired, especially after last year. We have seen a lot, we've had to deal with a lot, but we don't have the luxury of not being in this for the long haul. And we don't have the luxury of not doing what we can right now to make sure that we hit that 2030 framework in a way that gives our children and their children and 7 generations from now an opportunity to live and breathe on this planet. So I understand the frustration, but you got to be a long hauler for this work, and you got to have some perspective on that, and maybe just being able to embrace some history and understand what it's taken to get the victories that we've got, and even recognizing those as being fleeting in far too many instances. That's how I'd answer that.
Tamara, what do you think?
I think we need to recognize that the job of citizenry is a full-time job. Like we can build, as someone who has professionally thrown a lot of parking lot parties, mobilizations, actions. I'm responsible as a part of a team of the largest climate mobilization in history, only to be beaten by the very next one that happened. So getting 185 countries worth of people to show up on the same day to fight climate is nice. But you know what's also nice? Getting into the narrow hallways and the Zoom where it happens to make sure that the policy that we were out in the streets for actually becomes live, because that's how we move the things we care about into generations. None of us will live forever, but if we build the right laws to create the right foundation and responsible to policy that continues to have to be in communication with those who are impacted, it feels like we have a better recipe for the future. So it is exhausting, but so is being broke and tired and being moved around and running from flood and fire and mold and all the other things that there are no vacations in this life, and nothing about the democracy said that we were going to all each inherit a hammock. So I think people need to recognize that our politicians are only as good as our advocacy. Our accountability is what determines our relationships and the power that we hold now and our children have access to. And in this very state of Maryland, folks are fighting for a state constitutional right not to be poisoned now and forever. Like that fight has been going on. Why shouldn't we at the local level be really concerned with who puts what where and what that does to the future? These questions are exhausting, but losing is exhausting. Comorbidities are exhausting. Air pollution set up by people who came into your neighborhood, gave you a turkey and told you they were going to build a thing that then set you up to die from COVID, expensive at every level, exhausting at every level. So I think we just need to take off the table that living with other people is going to be easy, being a part of an ecosystem will be easy, or that people who we vote in by proxy should psychically know what it is we need if we're not continually going to be in relationship with them. I'll give you an example of this. I was a really great lobbyist at birth. I always wanted that one piece of caramel that my grandmother kept at the end of her purse. And what made it so that of all her grandchildren, I got it, was that I went everywhere she went. From the time that I knew it was in her purse through the end of the church service to the end of the day. And because I was with her all day, my retreat came out of her purse, and all the other kids asked, why did you get that? Well, I knew who my audience was, and I made sure that I understood what it is she needed and how our interests and being her interest and us being together and my interest in getting the caramel meant we were aligned. So I think we just need to take that level of strategic thinking about the future we want and hang with them that brought us. My grandmother was full of sayings as a woman in the South, and you come with them and that brought you to the party. And so we put the folks in office. It's time for us to stick with them until we see the things that we need to feel comfortable.
Jaelon, anything to add before we move into our other questions?
Certainly, I definitely respect both of what you two have just shared. I think they are focal, but I do want to hang our hat on another element that's might even beyond the conventional democratic channels we typically think of. I think putting the context of our conversation in human rights and civil rights was correct. And I will quote UChicago Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture's founding director, Michael Dawson, in stating that the most important organization across each historical epoch to the realization of Black advocacy has been the Black church. And I think there is a moral imperative to the urgency of this discussion as well. So last year, we saw the Church of England join 19 other faith-based institutions in the Epiphany for Declaration for Fossil-Free Churches. And I think that that movement, as well as what I'm sure many kids have been hearing via TikTok influenced songs and animated movies and cartoons, are the rhythms, and in some cases, the lyrics explicitly, from the spirituals. And one of the founding elements of the spirituals has been the natural world. And if you'll rest with me for a second here, some hymns: "Precious Lord, take my hand, and peace like a river, and we are often tossed and driven." I think that this is the kind of providence that's associated with some of the things that Tamara has been raising, with some of the things that Alan has been raising, that doesn't force us to reinvent the wheel and may very well empower us in ways that we've been able to build our communities even beyond the brick and mortar walls of places where we previously organized.
As we enter the final 20 minutes of the program, I'm going to go directly to the questions from our viewers, and I will read the question, and anyone who has an answer, feel free to jump in. Since Jaelon just brought up the Church of England and its epiphany for fossil-free churches, I'm going to turn to one of our international questions, because we have to realize we live on one planet. So the question is, as a Nigerian currently pursuing higher education in the United States, I would like to ask the panelists to speak to the international scope of this ecological justice. For example, pressuring from US oil companies on the US government to pressure Kenya to weaken its resolve on accepting plastic waste, and using that as a transit point for plastic waste to other countries in Africa. What is our international responsibility here?
If you don't mind, I'll jump in and say that I think it's really important for us to recognize there are no local climate issues that are not global climate issues. What the last 4 years has taught us is that failure to do a job means everyone fails the test. So we are not in a situation where there aren't real parallels between incineration and trash and the profligation of plastics all over every city, or the development of an ethane cracker in the Ohio River Valley that will destroy the air quality here in Maryland. That same work, that same bad deed, that same inappropriate expense created in a market that we should be ending as we transfer the things that are measured by whether or not they harm people, translates to great global policy. Whether we have a Green New Deal in the US is really important for whether we have a global Green New Deal. There are no conversations about reparations in the US South for discrimination against African Americans for their forceful removal to these lands. That doesn't connect to the pollution that happens in our front yard and our backyard, and whether or not we have setbacks and how close we live to agricultural harms from big, massive factory farming operations popping up all over the Eastern Shore. That also relates to the idea that as the US is the bad actor and driver of many global emissions conversations that we've been having in the public sphere. So while we're talking about domestic reparations, we also need to raise it in the context of a conversation around climate reparations, which in the global sphere is called loss and damage. What does it mean when a foreign power decides to return back to people who didn't ask to be oppressed, the island nations that they have always lived on? What does it mean? It means they avoid liability. So before we give them a hand clap for returning the island nation back to its status, we have to ask the question, what does that mean about the kind of borders they're going to build up as climate starts to wipe out all of those island nations? We are in the fight of our very lives. And the best way to think about it is to think about how the domestic work has to connect to the global pieces. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this question of whether we are going to be content at the local level, at the state level, at the regional level to play whack-a-mole about the bad things that we're doing. The incinerators, the smokestacks, the compressor stations, the well pads, the fossil fuel addictive pieces that are spilling out into the world, because every time we win, we get rid of coal in West Virginia or Pennsylvania or in this region, it ends up going to Africa or to China. And guess what? Those communities have not been set up to have the conversations that we have because they're continually being extracted from and divested. So this conversation around climate reparations, the conversation around loss and damage has to beg the question, are we going to keep playing whack-a-mole? We stop it here and it pops up over there? Or are we going to start?
I think we've lost Tamara there for a second. Alan, Jaelon, anything you want to add into that?
For sure. I think one of the most positive things that I can reference, and I did state previously, is that we have rejoined with the rest of the world in this battle in the past month and a half. And among those orders, the US will reconvene the Major Economies Forum. There will also be a new position created as the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, as well as directing the Director of National Intelligence to prepare a national intelligence estimate on the security implications of climate change, as well as a transmittal package through the State Department on the Montreal Protocol. And I think there is a litany of things that we have been recommitted to that we haven't over the past few years. And I think they're so timely headed into 2030, but let alone all that there is to come for many reasons across our world by mid-century.
Alan, anything to add on this issue?
Yeah, maybe quickly, but let me do a disclaimer here. This is me, not the National Parks Conservation Association. I think we have, I know I have, let me own this and I'll speak from the eye. I have an invisibility issue. And I think we're all going to have to work on the morality related to the invisibility issue, whereby if something isn't happening in my apartment, if it's not happening in my neighborhood, then probably things are okay. And Tamara was helping us to understand that that's just not the case. And what I think we need to look at, in addition to legislative solutions, political solutions, grassroots solutions, is maybe a new way of thinking about our relationship to each other. That we are all impacted by this. We're all impacted by a lot of things that are happening in this ecosystem of ours, whether it's strictly environmental, whether it's related to the climate emergency, whether it's related to justice, racism, whether it's related to misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, all these things that are impacting our communities, everybody who lives on the planet. And we're just going to have to do a better job. I'm going to have to do a better job coping with my invisibility issues. To note that just because I don't see it doesn't mean that there's not some issue that I need to be aware of, and to understand the way that my actions as a guy living in Washington, D.C. are going to impact somebody one border over, one state over, or across the ocean someplace. So I got to work on my invisibility issues.
Well, speaking of invisibility and being in bubble, here's another question from one of our viewers. How can we address racism in the politics of the environment, both in policies and bills that get passed, but also when working with people who mean well, but aren't necessarily in tune of what's going on outside of their bubble? Alan, you feel like taking that one on?
Well, yeah. And I mean, you know, the one answer to that is the thing that brought us all together, taking nature black. And the Audubon Naturalist Society, as an organization, putting an investment, the resources, the people, the time, the connections. You know, I don't know the ANS staff well. I've got the privilege of serving on the board. I know the organization. I think highly of it. You know, but this being a Wednesday morning, I'm sure a lot of the ANS staff that are working on this and monitoring this could be doing other things. They have chosen not to, in order to help put together this program for this week, Taking Nature Black, to bring people together to have conversations, to actually get folks to understand that, one, there are Black and brown people who are working on environmental issues, doing it at a high level and being impactful and effective. We just lost one. I hope she's able to rejoin our conversation before it ends. But then also to understand how the environment impacts people, but also is influenced by Black and brown people in ways that are incredibly positive. So I think there's that. And I think other green groups, large environmental conservation preservation organizations, including my own, we have an obligation to make sure that the policies that we're putting forward represent the full, true face of our constituents, not just necessarily the people who are sending in membership checks, but all of our constituents. And then for the national parks, to make sure that their programs and policies represent the true face of the United States. We need a 21st century national park system for a 21st century America. And God bless elk, but that they can't be the entire thing anymore. We've got to have some stories in there that reflect the diversity, the inclusivity, and talk about things like equity and justice in our national parks. So slowly, I think we have made some progress over the last couple of decades. Well, there are many, many more miles yet to go. But I think that's one of the things, is making sure that organizations like ANS and NPCA, all the other alphabet soups that are out there, and then the federal agencies that are working on this stuff too, take a lead in making sure that our work is just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive.
Jaelon, how can we address racism in the politics of the environment?
Well, I think two people that have been tasked with this for decades now that deserve to be mentioned would be Dr. Beverly Wright and Dr. Robert Bullard, starting respectively in Houston, but have since launched the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice HBCU Climate Change Consortium. And much to my panelist Alan's credit, I think it is a hallmark of investment in not only the people here today having these discussions, but the diversity in the environmental arena for generations to come. The world was long last beyond us, and it's really important to make sure that we're revitalizing some of those pipelines or creating them where they haven't existed for a long period of time. And there are a lot of organizations and people who may not wear conventional authority or leadership hats that are doing this work. And I do applaud them, and I remain thankful for them, because there are a lot of them in Maryland, as we all are familiar with, but many of them are doing distinct and very unique work in their own respective communities too.
Now, we know politics of the environment are local issues, they're state issues, they're national issues, they're international issues, but we also know that they are generational issues. So one of our viewers wants to know, how can we inspire and develop the next generation of political leaders in our communities? We're thinking about the youth who must carry on the conversation that we're having here right now today. So Alan, how do we inspire the next generation of political leaders to think and talk about this conversation that we're having right now?
Well, I think one of the ways is you have to listen to them, and then you have to engage them. Again, allowing people to decide when and where they enter. So as a guy who's starting to get membership appeals from AARP, when I waltz into a community, it's not my job to sit people down and lecture them about why they should love national parks. My job is to sit there and listen to them about what kind of experiences they have, what inspires them, what makes them interested in a national park, or why are they not interested in these sorts of things. It's attempting to engage people where they are, again, being okay with that complexity, that not everybody's going to agree with me about what my top 10 priorities are, but then seeing if there are ways to reach people and then giving them leadership. And then what is very important, I think, Jesse, is demonstrating to somebody how love for the environment, working on climate solutions, can actually lead to a higher degree, enhanced employment opportunities, jobs, and job training. And I think sometimes what we want to do is, with young people, is to say to them, you need to love this because I love this, and that's the only reason why. And I don't think that works as well as it used to, if it ever worked at all.
Jaelon, as our designated young person on this panel, how do we get young people to care about the environment?
Well, I think listening, per Alan's remarks, is one of the best ways. I think over the past 2 summers, we've seen many citizens of this country below the age of 24 speak about this democracy, speak about their relation to other people in their communities, and speak about the globe. And I think that's been an international push, and it's boiled all the way down to our communities locally. And the other thing that I would suggest here would be encouraging them that pursuing environmental policy or being interested in your natural world around you isn't in isolation of all the other dreams, desires, and intellectual passions that you may have. It is interdisciplinary. It reinforces a lot of things that you already do. And quite frankly, it can transform the quality of life in your community for your loved ones and all of those that are seeking to come and live beside you in the future. So I think underscoring that is going to be important, because the new generation we have in this country knows what they want. They just need a little bit of guidance and maybe a gentle nudge here and there on how to get there and navigate. And I think that is a lot of our responsibility as well.
Tamara, how do we get our young people into this conversation?
We get out of their way. I have no experience that this work is not multi-generational. I think that there might be cultural differences. So where you might see like a Greta Thunberg in the front, in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, we're very protective of the young. We're very protective of the elderly and vulnerable. And so the fact that we are multi-generations deep into this work is whether or not you see that depends on how good a relationship you're in with us. And I have been inspired by Jerome Foster from round about these parts and other folks who are 15, 16, 17, the climate striker who represented Fridays for Future as a young lady who stood outside the Maryland steps for an entire year, just 2 years ago, and built a whole rally with all of the youth from all over the state. So I actually have no recollection of this time period when this work was not driven by youth. Whether we're talking about civil rights and people fighting at their university spaces, folks getting out into the streets and being hosed by dogs, hit with hoses and running from dogs, or folks standing outside to fight for climate strikes. I have never seen this work succeed without the elderly and the youth engaged. And I think what we need to do is give them resources, give them space, give them legal protections, and then get out of their way and then do what they have asked us to do over and over again.
Another one of our viewers wants to know how we align our interests with other people in the United States who are also minority. So the question is, how can there be more alignment between Black and Indigenous people around environmental issues? I'll throw it out to the panelists, see who wants to answer.
I can jump in since I did the disappearing act and give my colleagues just a moment to recover. I actually think we're already doing it. There's a myth that we don't work together. There was no way that we got ourselves out of slavery by virtue of doing it alone and because people suddenly felt different. Lots of folks were fighting alongside us to get it done. And that's true now. In discussing the work that we have to do with climate reparations at the local level and the national level, that relates really closely to Indigenous calls for land back. The folks who have been stewarding this land without harming it for millennia have a lot to say. And I think that if we get into that continuum that Alan was talking about, we'll recognize we're not alone in this work. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the Asian community threw down for Black lives like I've never seen it over the last year or two. And so I actually think what we should do is spend more time figuring out how to keep us from having colonialist fights that are not about us and look at the future that we want to build, making room for one another. I am so supportive of communities across this country who are fighting to have setbacks so that there are 2,500 feet between them and things that can kill them. That's true for folks here in Maryland. And the communities fighting that might be Latinx and Asian and Black and Richmond, California, but they're also those same communities here in Maryland. So I actually reject the premise that we are not already working together. We just might need to be seen doing it.
Alan, Jaelon, either one of you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I think there's countless examples all across the diaspora where those two are not mutually exclusive. My grandmother was both Black and Indigenous, and the way she lived her life really impacted the work I do now. And I think all across the Chesapeake watershed and many other areas of the country, you have countless examples for the tributaries that serve as our arteries, whose namesake bear those Indigenous nations and peoples. So I definitely think that they're already happening. We need to encourage them to happen more. And I think we need to expand our environmental discussions to be multinational, multicultural, and multilingual, because there is a lot to be offered here.
Alan?
I'd just say I'm happy we finally changed the damn name of the Washington football team.
Well, I would love to keep this conversation going on for another hour. It has been fabulous, but unfortunately we are running out of time. There were so many other great questions that I wish we could have gotten to, but to end up this program, I want to give all of you a chance to add on one final thought. Jaelon, we'll start with you. Last words.
Please reach out. Our assembly is in session. Your local municipalities are working on this day in and day out, and your federal legislators do want to hear from you at the outset of a new session. So please don't think that any volume is too low and any mode of communication is not credible. We need to hear from you, and many of us are listening. I can attest to that personally.
Alan, quick final words.
I'd just say thanks to ANS and thanks to you, Jesse, for moderating a really great panel.
Tamara,
Sure.
final thoughts.
Unless you have a plane ticket to Mars, this is your work. It'll get a lot easier if more of us get into it. So jump in this ditch.
And I would like to thank all of you for listening to what has been a fabulous panel. Make sure you continue to follow what's going on, Take Nature Black. I would like to thank our great panelists for what has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you, all of you.